The first thing I ever learned about living in a planned community like Oak Creek Estates wasn't about the property values or the pristine lawns. It was that some people look at a tiny bit of neighborhood authority and see a crown. And that morning, as I sat in my home office with the smell of fresh coffee and the steady, comforting hum of my radio rig, I had no idea that someone's delusions of grandeur were about to collide head-on with federal law at about 60 miles per hour. I was mid-transmission, talking to a guy named Dave out in Nebraska about a massive cell of supercells moving across the plains, part of my job as a Skywarn spotter, when suddenly the audio just clipped into this sickening, sharp static and then went stone-cold dead. And I mean dead, like the soul of the machine had been ripped out through the floorboards. At first, I thought maybe a power surge or a faulty capacitor, but then I caught that scent, the acrid, unmistakable tang of ionized copper and burnt rubber, and my gut just sank because equipment doesn't in oppos. T just fail that cleanly unless someone's helping along. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood, and I looked out the side window toward the alleyway where my main feed line runs up the side of the house toward the tower. And there he was, this guy I'd seen patrolling the neighborhood in a golf cart, but today he was on foot, crouching right by my foundation. He was wearing this ridiculous black tactical vest, the kind you'd buy at a surplus store to feel important, and across the back, in those cheap, iron-on white letters that were already starting to peel at the corners, it said in quote, Oak Creek Compliance Officer, in quote, and he was holding a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters like he was some kind of urban commando. I didn't oppose. To even put on shoes, I just burst through the side door, the gravel biting into my socks, and I yelled, and quote, you touch that cable again and you're going to regret it, and quote. And I think the sheer volume of it made him jump nearly out of his skin. He turned around, tried to adjust those knockoff aviator sunglasses, and he had this look on his face, this mix of smug superiority and a flickering, deep-seated fear that he'd been caught doing something he couldn't and oppose. T explain away, end quote. Morning, Mr. Miller, end quote. He said, trying to steady his voice and puffing out his chest so the in oppos, compliance and oppos, logo would look more imposing, end quote. I'm just performing a forced abatement as authorized by the board because your unauthorized transmission array is in direct violation of the updated aesthetic and safety guidelines, section 4.2, and since you ignored the letters, we're taking it down for you, end quote. I just stared at him, my jaw so tight it felt like it might crack, and I looked down at the thick, expensive coaxial cable, the lifeline of my emergency station, which was now dangling uselessly, severed in one clean, brutal snip. End quote. Do you have any idea what you just did? End quote. I asked him, my voice coming out low and dangerous, end quote. That ISN and oppos, TTV antenna, and that ISN and oppos, TA clothesline. You just cut a federally licensed communications line that is registered with the county's emergency management agency, end quote. He actually scoffed, a dry, pathetic little sound, and he waved the cutters in the air like a wand, telling me that the HOA has full jurisdiction over everything within the property lines, and that his and oppos, orders and oppos, came directly from Brenda Vance. Now, if you've never lived in a place with a Brenda Vance, consider yourself blessed, because Brenda was the kind of woman who treated the neighborhood Facebook group like a courtroom and her clipboard like a holy relic, a woman who had spent the last 6 months sending me increasingly unhinged certified letters. She claimed my radio tower, which, by the way, was well within the legal height limits and professionally installed, was in quote, beaming cancer rays in quote, into the neighborhood kids and oppos, bedrooms and in quote, ruining the skyline in quote, of our cul-de-sac, which was hilarious considering the skyline was mostly just beige siding and power lines. I tried to be the bigger man. I'd sent her copies of my FCC license. I'd invited her over to see how it worked. I'd even explained how I was the one who provided the backup comms for the local hospital during the 2022 ice storm when the towers went down, but Brenda didn't in oppos. She wants safety. She wanted control. End quote. Brenda doesn't in oppos. T on the airwaves, end quote. I told a guy, whose name I remember was Kevin, a guy who used to work at a mall and now thought he was Delta Force because Brenda gave him a vest, and I stepped closer into his personal space until he had to look up at me. End quote. Kevin, listen to me very carefully because your life is about to get very complicated. The Federal Communications Commission doesn't in oppos. T care about your in oppos, aesthetic guidelines and oppos, and they certainly Don and Oppos. T care about Brenda and Oppos. S afternoon bridge club. End quote. He laughed, but it was nervous now, and he tried to push past me to get to the second line, saying he was going to finish the job or Brenda would have his job. And that's when I saw the red light on my eaves mounted. Security camera blinking right at him. I pointed up at it and said, end quote, "I've got you in 4K, Kevin. I got the audio of you admitting you're here on Brenda's orders, and I've got the physical evidence of you tampering with a licensed emergency station. That's a felony. 10 years in a federal pen if the judge is having a bad day. So you might want to put those cutters down before you cut your own throat, metaphorically speaking," end quote. He froze, his hand twitching on the handle of the cutters, and for a second, I thought he was actually going to swing them at me because his face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple, and he started stammering about how, end quote, "we in Oppos read the law in this neighborhood," end quote, and how I'd be hearing from their attorneys. I didn't in Oppos. T back down, I just stood there in my socks, feeling the cold ground and the heat of the situation, and I told him, end quote, "Go ahead, call Brenda. Tell her to come down here and watch the feds roll up because I already hit the silent alarm on my rig that pings the local dispatch when my signal goes flat unexpectedly." End quote. That was a bit of a bluff. I'd actually just called the regional FCC enforcement office the moment I saw him on the camera, but the effect was the same. Kevin backed away, nearly tripping over a decorative garden gnome, and he scrambled back to his little golf cart, shouting that I'd be, end quote, evicted by Monday, end quote, while I just stood there, watching him flee like a scolded dog. But the thing about people like Brenda is that they don and Oppos. T know when to stop, and about 10 minutes later, I saw her black luxury SUV come screaming around the corner, stopping so hard it left skid marks on the asphalt. She hopped out, clipboard in hand, looking like she was ready to go to war, and she started screaming before her feet even hit my driveway, calling me a, end quote, terrorist to the community, end quote, and telling me that she was having my tower dismantled and hauled to the scrap yard by the end of the day. I didn't in Oppos. T say a word. I just folded my arms and waited because in the distance, I could hear it, the low, rhythmic hum of heavy engines, not the high-pitched whine of local sirens, but something much more substantial. 3 matte black Suburbans turned onto our street, moving with a kind of synchronized professional purpose that you only see from people who do this for a living, and they didn't in Oppos. T stopped at the curb. They pulled right onto the grass, flanking Brenda's SUV like they were boxing in a suspect. The doors opened in unison, and out stepped 6 men in suits and windbreakers, and the guy in the lead didn't in Oppos. T looked like a local cop. He had that, end quote, government tan, end quote, and a badge on his belt that caught the morning sun with a blinding glint. End quote. Federal Communications Commission, Enforcement Bureau, end quote. He announced, his voice like cold iron, and he didn't in Oppos. To even look at Brenda, he walked straight over to me and asked, end quote, "Mr. Miller, are you the operator of the station that just reported a malicious interference event?" End quote. I nodded, pointing toward the severed cable and the trembling Kevin who was now hiding behind Brenda. And the agent just looked at the cut wire, then at Kevin's, end quote, compliance, end quote, vest, and he let out a sigh that sounded like a funeral bell. Brenda, God bless her ego, actually tried to intercept him, waving her clipboard and shouting about, end quote, local ordinances, end quote, and, end quote, neighborhood sovereignty, end quote, and the agent just held up a hand, one single hand, and she went silent like someone had hit a mute button, end quote. Mind Oppos. End quote. He said, and the way he said it made my hair stand on top of my head, end quote. You are currently obstructing a federal investigation into the deliberate destruction of an emergency communication relay. If you say one more word about an HOA, I'm going to have the U.S. Marshals come down here and explain the supremacy clause of the Constitution to you in a jail cell. End quote. Her face went from, end quote, neighborhood queen, end quote, to, end quote, frightened toddler, end quote, in about 3 seconds flat, especially when 2 more agents started pulling evidence bags out of their trunk and another began photographing the severed line with a high-end DSLR. They spent the next 4 hours turning Oak Creek estates inside out, and it turned out that Brenda had an Oppos. T just been targeting me. She'd been using the HOA funds to hire, end quote, security, end quote, like Kevin harass anyone she didn't in Oppos. T like, but my radio tower was the one thing she couldn't in Oppos. T touch. And her ignorance of federal law was the thread that unraveled her entire little empire. They found records in her office of, in quote, orders, in quote, to sabotage my equipment, emails where she bragged about, in quote, cutting the cord on the freak next door, in quote, and even evidence of embezzlement to pay for Kevin's, in quote, tactical gear, end quote. By the time the sun began to set, Kevin was in handcuffs in the back of a county cruiser, looking like he was about to cry, and Brenda was being led out of her house in a pair of very expensive-looking silver bracelets. Her clipboard dropped and forgotten in the gutter. In the end, the court didn't oppose. Play around. Kevin got 3 years for felony interference and impersonating an officer, though he flipped on Brenda so fast it made the prosecutor an oppose. As head spin, and Brenda got the book thrown at her. 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy, wire fraud related to the HOA funds, and a massive fine that basically liquidated her entire estate, including that house she was so worried about the, in quote, skyline, in quote, of. As for me, the FCC helped me get a grant for a full system upgrade because of the, in quote, malicious nature, in quote, of the attack, and now my tower is 10 feet taller, made of aircraft-grade aluminum, and shines like a beacon of justice every time the sun hits it. But it makes you wonder, doesn't it, oppose? How many people are living next door to a Brenda Vance right now, just waiting for them to trip over a law they didn't and oppose? Tino existed. Was I wrong to push it that far? To let the feds handle a neighborhood dispute? Or is there a point where, in quote, being a good neighbor, in quote, has to take a back seat to, in quote, defending your rights, in quote? I see people in the comments all the time saying HOAs should be illegal, but then I see others saying we need them to keep people from painting their houses neon pink. So where do we draw the line? Is a radio tower a, in quote, community hazard, in quote, or a, in quote, lifeline, in quote? And who gets to decide? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think Brenda got what she deserved or if the government overstepped into a private community matter. Because I'm still sitting here listening to the static, wondering if the next knock on my door is going to be a friend or another, in quote, officer, in quote, with a pair of cutters. Don and Oppos. Forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more about how the, in quote, little guy, in quote, occasionally gets to win against the clipboard brigade.